So if you watched my intro video, you'll know that once upon a time, I was also a developer. And throughout my years of developing, I kind of, enhanced my way of developing through trial and error. And I kind of stumbled upon a pretty effective way of developing. And it was developing in a way that was, yes, delivering quality development, but also doing it in a time efficient way. And when I say quality of delivery, I don't mean just get the thing done. I mean do it in a way that gets you noticed, right? That your team members appreciate what you've done. So in this video, I will show you 3 tips that I think will really elevate your skills as a developer and that you can definitely incorporate into your developing style. But before I go into that, I guess let's talk about why you want to get better. And there's probably a few different reasons you want to do, and you're going to fall into a different category. So maybe you're a new developer, so you've just kind of stumbled upon X++ and you're kind of trying to think of ways to improve yourself as a developer and trying to do it in a way that is quick, I guess, because you don't want to kind of stumble around too much and take too long to get good at what you're doing. Or maybe you're a developer that's developed for maybe a few years now, and you're kind of trying to think of ways in which you can be more efficient at what you're doing. And maybe you're even noticing that other developers around you are kind of going ahead of you and delivering things quickly and are getting noticed more, and you want to get to that stage as well. And maybe you're like a senior developer that's just clicked on this video, and you never know, this might also be useful to you as well. So the first tip I have for you is don't write code that already exists, because there's so much code already out there. There's no reason why you need to go off and make something of your own, right? Why do that? And it was the first thing my boss said to me, right? He was sitting next to me on my first day of development. He was showing me the user interface, and he was like, Mags, if there's one thing that you need to do is do not write code that already exists. And if I see you doing it, I will fire you, is literally what he said. So this obviously stuck into my mind. But also, remember, I'm coming from like a university background where plagiarism is a massive thing. And so it was a little bit of a shock to be told, oh, hold on, now you can actually copy other pieces of code. So, but obviously coding is completely different to writing and delivering something at university. So imagine a scenario now, which is very common, where you're a developer and you've been given a design document, right? So we normally call it a functional design document that tells you this is what you need to develop. So as you're going down the document, you're probably reading, okay, this is what I need to do. And one thing you shouldn't do is just dive headfirst into development. What you should do instead is take into consideration a couple of things. So the first thing you should take into consideration is, does the functionality that the design document says already exist in F&SCM? And this is very common, right? And a lot of the times the functional consultant or whoever wrote the document might know that the functionality already exists. So they will say in the document, copy this functionality from there because it's exactly how I want it to work. And then that's kind of very straightforward for you to just go into the code and figure out, this is where I need to copy, and then just reuse that code as you need to. But in some instances, the consultant might not be aware that that functionality already exists, which is quite common, right? Because F&SCM is massive, and there's no way that it's going to know that something exists 100%. So in that case, one thing you can do is talk to a colleague, right? Because you're probably working with other functional consultants, and they will probably have maybe an idea of if that functionality exists or not. And the other thing you can do is just check on Google or your favorite search engine, because if something already exists, then there's probably a good chance that you'll find it in Google. And so by doing these small checks, it might take you about 30 or so minutes, but you end up saving so much more time, and possibly you could save hours and days from having to create something that already exists. Say you've done all these checks now, and you find out that the functionality doesn't exist and it's completely brand new, which is completely fine. But what you can still do is check to see if there's functionality within what you're asked to do that exists in F&SCM. And what I mean by that is, let's take an example, right? So you might have a functionality that you need to develop, and within that functionality, it asks you to develop a list panel. So a list panel is a fairly common element in F&SCM, right? It's kind of like two small boxes, and then you have a little element in one box, and you basically say, when I click this button, I want to move that element from one box to the other box. So a very common component in F&SCM, right? And what you can do is just very quickly search around in F&SCM for that similar component, or if you don't know, again, check on Google, and you can see whether it exists, check in the code, and just reuse that code. And these bits of components will be spotted around the functionality you're asked to develop. So you'll find that by doing this, even though the functionality as a whole doesn't exist, individual components do exist in the system, and so you're kind of taking what you need, and so saving yourself a lot of time in the process. All of that is based on reusing existing Microsoft code. But there might be instances where you might be a developer who's working in complete isolation, which is a perfectly common scenario, right? And you don't have anyone to talk to, and you can't reach out to anyone. So therefore, you need to think of other ways in which you can achieve this. And what you can do here is, go straight onto the World Wide Web, right? So go into Google straight away, and there's a really vibrant F&SCM or even Dynamics 365 community as a whole online, where you have forums where people answer questions, you have loads of blog posts, right? So there's so much content out there that if you're stuck on something, or if you want to check for functionality that already exists, then just reach out to the World Wide Web straight away and just browse through that content. Spend a few minutes doing that. But a word of warning is that there's so much content out there that you do get, let's say, questionable content that you probably don't want to reuse. So in that case, it's perfectly fine. All you need to do is just remember, you're never ever just copying something straight off the internet into your own code, right? You're always having to check to see that what that code is meets what you need to do, and it also isn't cluttered with a whole bunch of best practice violations. Because the last thing you want to do is just copy code that it does not deliver what you need to deliver. So the second tip I have for you is, don't try to be a perfect developer. And this takes me back to my first days of developing in X++, where I'd just joined my company and I'd been in for a few months, I guess, and we had a contractor join us. And this guy was a Microsoft MVP. He had very well known in the community. He had his own blog posts and all that kind of stuff. And he was also an amazing developer, right? This guy was so good at developing, and I learned so much from him. I'd spend hours just looking at his code and seeing how I can learn from him. So I was really glad I met him, and I learned a lot from him. But he was with us for a few months, but then he left quite soon afterwards. And when I was talking to my boss, I found out that he wasn't too happy with his performance, and I was like, what do you mean? This guy was like the best developer in the world. How can you not be happy with what he's done? And what he told me was that yes, he was a good developer, but he took twice as long to develop than the estimate provided, right? And so this was a problem, because you can imagine you're kind of dealing with clients, and you said to the client, this is going to take 10 days to do, and then instead of 10 days it takes 20 days to do, right? And this was a surprise to me, because surely someone of his quality could develop twice as fast as anyone else, right? But obviously it doesn't work that way. And this was a really important lesson for me to learn early on in my career, because I learned that it wasn't just about your technical ability. There's also a lot of other things you have to take into consideration. And I'll talk about that in a lot of my other videos coming up. But to the point of this video, your code does not have to be perfect. And so there's a few things that you can try and do, or try and think about, so that you don't fall into that trap. So first up are best practice warnings. So you're probably aware of these, and these are warnings that Microsoft have built into the system, so that whenever you compile your code, they want to check that the code that you've written adheres very well to the best practice standards and you don't have anything silly in there. And this is perfectly fine. It's a very good thing in the system, so that you are always tracking to make sure that you're developing a good quality code. But having said that, there's a lot of best practice warning violations that aren't really relevant, all right? Or there might be something from the past versions of AX, as it was called, that you don't really need to worry about. And so what you can do in these situations is talk to your perhaps senior developer or whoever's in charge of development on the project you're on, and start building what we call a suppression file, which is essentially an XML file where you can list to say, you know, these best practice warnings I don't really care about because they don't add any value. And so what you end up doing over a period of time is you build up this list of suppressions that you don't care about, and so therefore when you compile your code, instead of crawling through a million best practice violation warnings, you only end up having to focus on the violations that matter, right? And so obviously you want to do that because then you can focus your effort 100% on writing code that matters. So the next thing I want to talk about is commenting your code, or over commenting your code. And well, to start with, obviously commenting your code is very important, but only comment where you have to. And this is a bit of a funny one because as developers, we're kind of almost forced, we just want to write code, right? And we're almost forced to just comment code. And in some cases, it's gotten so extreme that we're just now commenting code just for the sake of it, without realizing why we're commenting code. There are a few things to take into consideration. The first is a concept called self-documenting code. And this is where you're not even commenting code, right? You're just writing your code in a way that the reader can understand your code. So you're essentially writing it in a human readable format. And I can give you a really straightforward example. So let's say you had to write a method where you're calculating delivery dates. So instead of calling the method calculate dates, call it calculate delivery dates, right? So immediately you've just transformed a kind of ambiguous method into something that is just one small change, right? But now the person reading it knows, okay, I've come into this method, and this obviously calculates delivery dates. And so you can apply the same concept to things like variables as well. And so what you end up doing is writing code that's very easy to read and understandable. But of course, you will eventually write more complex code where you can't just rely on your self-documenting code, because you can't write code that documents everything, right? And so that's where you need to write comments, yeah? And when you write comments, just be succinct. So you just write code that explains the complex part of the code that you've written. And so what you end up with is a set of code that is easy to understand, but also hasn't sucked all your time in just commenting stuff that you don't have to comment. The third and final tip I have for you is communication. And this is a really important one because as developers, it's very easy to get into the habit of just getting the job done and telling the project manager, hey, I've finished. And it's something I also did when I was just starting off. And I quickly learned that, you know, it's not the best way and it's not the smartest way to be a developer. But at the same time, I understand why developers are like that, right? Because it's very easy to be just engrossed in your work, and maybe you're working in isolation, and maybe you have maybe language barriers as well. For example, you might be in a country that's not where the main language isn't the language of the project, and so you might have kind of some language barriers as well, which is completely fine, and I completely understand. So what I like to do when I'm coaching my developers is tell them, don't be afraid of communicating, right? And it might be a confidence issue, which is completely fine. It might be a case of, maybe you're not so confident in your development skills, which I can help with. But you should also think of it as a learning journey, right? So even though you might not be the best communicator at the start, as long as you work on it and carry on working on it, it's something that you can improve on. I'll show you 2 really easy things that you can do to kickstart your journey as a better communicator. So first up is you're probably developing something that a function consultant has written or someone else has written. And the thing you should do is take them on that journey with you. And so you can do this by setting up regular checkpoints. So you're constantly talking to the person that wrote the document, is this what you wanted to do? Is this what you've written? And so by doing this, what you end up doing is you can kind of always troubleshoot issues a lot earlier, because they can tell you, no, this isn't what I wanted. Can you make it do this instead? And so because you're doing that, what you end up doing is, rather than going to the end of the development cycle and then telling them, okay, I finished, and finding out you've got a whole bunch of things that aren't what's specified in the document, you kind of fix your issues a lot earlier on in the cycle. So when you do reach the end of the development, you've basically got something that works straight off the bat. But it's not always possible to stay within the timelines. And in this case, your best friend should be your project manager, right? Because the project manager is the person that's sitting in between you and the client, or the person that's expecting the deliverable. And so if something's going to take a little bit longer than expected, the project manager needs to communicate that to the end stakeholder. And so what you don't want to do is tell your project manager right up until at the very end, oh hey, I'm a little bit late on this. Okay, and because obviously the project manager at that point is going to be, what do you mean? You've just told me this now? So don't get into that situation, right? So what you can do instead is be in, again, constant communication with your project manager. So depending on how long the development is, or when it's estimated to be finished, just set up regular checkpoints with them and just say, or just give regular updates at the end of a day, just to say, this is how far I've progressed. I might be finishing this early even, or I'm facing kind of a few issues. It might take longer than I expected. And in most cases, that's completely fine, right? Because as long as you've told your project manager and they've got early visibility of how long it's going to take, they can then convey that to the client. And so the client will also probably be more understanding and say, okay, at least I know earlier that this is going to take so long. So by keeping this open line of communication with your project manager, what you end up doing is everyone in the project is always aware of where you are. And at the end of the day, this is what contributes to the success of the project. So we're coming to the end of the video, but hopefully those tips I've given you kind of give you an insight into the things you should be thinking about as a developer. And it's not just coding. Just take a step back and think about all the other components of development and take those tips into consideration. And I think if you do that, you will find yourself very quickly elevating yourself as a developer and noticing really quick improvements. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya.